Chapter 26. Mrs. James. When my father asks my mother to reconsider, her answer is an outburst of anger and hurt. I'd give anything to rewind to the day I found that newspaper article. What was I thinking? Mrs. James's house is surrounded by roses, and I suddenly wonder how Carly's doing at learning camp. And just like our visit to Carly's, I ask my mother if I can wait in the car. "You started this," my mom says. "You might as well see how it ends." Mrs. James meets us in the garden. She's wearing green boots, tan shorts, and a bright pink shirt. Even though her hair is very blonde, she looks much older than my parents. "I didn't expect you until tomorrow, but please come in." She seemed touched to finally meet us and gives my mother a hug. Mom wears the same pinched expression she has when my Uncle Bob visits with a new girlfriend. Mrs. James bends down to shake my hand. "And you must be Derek. Let's get you some lemonade." We follow her to the kitchen, where she takes a pitcher from the fridge. The half slices of lemon float in the container like sunny smiles. I wonder if they'll change to frowns after Mom gives Mrs. James a piece of her mind. Even though Mrs. James lied all those years about the facts of her daughter's death, I pray Mom doesn't let her see the anger she displayed in the car. My father looks as worried as I do. The walls are filled with unframed photos of Susan in a giant collage that reminds me of the photos of patients in Mom's office. I tug Mom's sleeve and point to the collage, but her mind is focused on this decade-long injustice. Susan would have been 28 next week. Mrs. James runs her finger with its bright pink nail across the photo of her daughter holding a cat. "About that day," my mother begins. Mrs. James turns toward my mother, and the earth stops spinning on its axis. Or at least that's how it seems to me. Mrs. James's eyes are filled with such sadness. They actually halt the words coming out of my mother's mouth. No matter what Mrs. James made up about Susan's heroism, the woman lost her daughter. And judging by the look in her eyes, it might as well have been yesterday. I've never seen my mom struggle the way she does now. She stares at her feet, shakes her head, and after a few moments looks up. "Susan sounds like a wonderful girl," my mom says. "Please tell us more." And just like that, Mrs. James' face lights up, and she shows us pictures of Susan at her dance recital. Susan with her grandparents in Germany, Susan and the child she tutored after school. No one interrupts her, and we nod with enthusiasm as Mrs. James goes from photo to photo. My mother puts her arm on mine for just a second, then turns her attention back to Mrs. James. In all the movies I've watched, I don't think I've seen anyone make a bigger sacrifice than Mom makes today. When we leave a few hours later, my mother and Mrs. James hug for a long time. As we pull out of the driveway, my mom stares out the window. "Are we done with the story of Susan James?" she finally asks. "It's official. The story is closed," I say. But there's a new one that needs our immediate attention. When she turns in her seat to face me, she's smiling. "And what's that?" "When do we eat?" Mom tries to grab me, but I slide across the seat toward Bodhi. "I guess Mom picked the right dog when she rescued Bodhi from the shelter all those years ago," Dad says. I nod, but the truth is that Lauren's story doesn't make me love Bodhi more. Not because I don't appreciate that he saved my life, but because it's impossible for me to love him one bit more than I already do. I'm his Calvin, and he's my Hobbes. Always have been, always will be. Bodhi lies on my lap, belly up, and I rub him vigorously. "You had my diaper in your mouth, you dirty dog. I hope it wasn't full of poop." He meets my eyes as if to say, "I would have saved you anyway, you big knucklehead."